an auto recording to accompany the PowerPoint on roots of recovery. I have a chance to extrapolate at greater length on a couple of items than I will in class. I've designed this graphic so it's in the PowerPoint, and the references um, are in the PowerPoint, but not in this presentation, this audio presentation. I've had some technical problems, so this is where I've ended up with it working best. The roots of recovery, primarily the strongest root from which recovery has arisen, is psychiatric survivors themselves. You could say there have been a number of psychiatric survivor movements, ex-patient movements, consumer movements, regardless, psychiatric survivors. Psychosocial, psychiatric rehabilitation has also made a considerable and important contribution to recovery. I'm going to touch on briefly a longitudinal study that I put with dotted lines because it is supportive to the idea of recovery, but not other than its support to psychiatric survivors and to PSR. It was a study done in Vermont by Harding. It's in the references, where 118 patients with schizophrenia hospitalized in the mid 1950s. They looked at the trajectory of their lives over 32 years and found that one half to two-thirds of those 118 people with schizophrenia had achieved considerable improvement or recovered. So that was a radical finding. It contradicts the DSM, stating that the outcome for people with schizophrenia is poor. So it has supported this idea of recovery from schizophrenia. The anti-psychiatry movement, I'm not sure where it belongs, and so I'm kind of mentioning it in passing. It refers to a critique from within psychiatry, kind of an anti-intellectual backlash. So it was important in supporting psych survivors and mental health activists in the civil rights movement at an earlier time. It was often led by social scientists and by psychiatrists themselves, such as R.D. Laing or famously Thomas Szasz, The Myth of Mental Illness. More importantly, let's get to this psych survivor route of recovery. I've got three sections under psychiatric survivors. They overlap all over the place, but you can talk about a civil rights movement for mental patients. During the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of civil rights movements going on. Black power, feminism, civil rights for people with physical disabilities. Mental patients' civil rights didn't experience the same kind of ongoing success, although it certainly is still going on today. It is perhaps reborn today. Take a look at some links I put there for Mental Patient Association. It is still operating today under the word society rather than association. And there's two documentaries about the Mental Patient Association. It developed in Vancouver in the 1970s. And it was quite radical for its time. It was internationally a leader in mental patient activism. It was an organization, it grew quite large, and as I say, it's still operating. It supplied self help. People organized and supported each other, supplying services such as housing and drop ins. And it built considerably from there. It also provided activism in the sense of civil rights advocacy and critique of psychiatry and mental health. Now, self help is a powerful force in recovery and in mental health in general, so that much of the mental health activism rising out of the 70s by psych survivors involved organizing to provide services themselves. And self-help organizations, non-governmental organizations, are still a powerful force in mental health in our communities today, providing public education, advocacy, lobbying governments, and providing direct services. Now, narrative. This is lived experience narratives of mental illness and recovery. This is people themselves speaking up for public awareness, for educating professionals, and for inspiring, encouraging, and mentoring others. Daring to come out of the shadows, to speak up and be counted. Patricia Deegan is an important name in recovery. She is an individual with lived experience and also later became a PhD in psychology and lobbied, advocated personal narratives and developing that concept of recovery. So importantly, she defined recovery and she defined it as something the individual does. It's a journey the individual is on, as opposed to professional services which might support that person in their recovery or offer resources to that person in their own recovery journey. But she really popularized the idea of recovery as a journey. And lived experience narratives were also important in developing the knowledge base of recovery and what are the recovery principles. So much of the early work on recovery was a thematic analysis of the lived experience recovery narratives, personal narratives that were out there. What were the common themes? What were the common elements? So we have civil rights activists, we have people developing self-help systems, sophisticated self-help systems, and we have people speaking their own stories, and that becoming a valid knowledge base, moving all together to form this body of knowledge we call recovery. So, like, what do we call recovery? So, at first, it was kind of like a model, and then paradigm, because it's bigger than a model. Some people have called it a movement, but it's a multifaceted movement. It's not a single movement. And now people are starting to talk about it as a philosophy. But let's call it a big yellow star for now. Psych survivors, major root developing this recovery paradigm. I'll call it paradigm. It's offered support by a longitudinal study that said, yeah, hey, recovery is possible. Supported initially, at least, in challenges to psychiatry from within psychiatry. And later, we'll talk about the kind of current day um, manifestations of this psych survivor um, movements and elements. Now, I'll turn to another route of recovery, and that's psychosocial and psychiatric rehabilitation. It developed primarily in response to deinstitutionalization when large numbers of people who had been institutionalized in mental asylums were discharged into the community. People who had lost skills and abilities through the process of institutionalization and through the process of um, living with severe symptoms, as well as the side effects of treatment. So the psychosocial, or let's just say PSR model, especially at the beginning, really focused on building skills, on assessing what skills people need to live in the community and to integrate back into communities, to how to assess what an individual person might need, and then to build bodies of knowledge and processes for teaching people in regaining those skills. The Boston University College Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation is very critical in this PSR model. A name to know is William Anthony. He wrote extensively, particularly in the 90s, about recovery and developing recovery as a body of knowledge, particularly in the ways in which PSR supports recovery. The Boston University College Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation has done a lot of publishing, a lot of research, and has a training program so that its PSR model has been propagated around the world, including Manitoba, and including as a foundation for the development of this course. So we'll learn lots more about the PSR model, but what's really important to remember is that PSR is not the same thing as recovery. PSR is not recovery. Recovery is something the individual goes through, works on. It's their journey. And psychosocial rehab and recovery, PSR, is a professional model that is broadly thought of and is designed to be supportive to individuals in their psychiatric journeys. The bottom left-hand corner here talks about a recovery-oriented practice, how recovery gets implemented into practice. We'll talk about that later. And the bottom right-hand corner is kind of looking at the manifestation of psychiatric survivors and activism in the current day. And we'll talk about that later in the course too. So take a look at the PowerPoint. You'll see some good links. And in particular, when you have a chance, take a look at the documentaries on the Mental Patient Association. They're interesting. They're not too long, and they're um, kind of fun to watch. So, thank you for bearing with me, and take care.